members and guests from, I'm not sure where, renewable energy guests. Renario Barriaga, Mauro Sobers, and Julio Mateo. Welcome.
Presentation of petitions, presentation of papers.
Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I am commanded to lay the following documents: the annual report and audited financial statements of the Barbados Port, Inc. for the year ended March 31st, 2023, as well as the audited statement of accounts for the Board of Management of the Lodge School for the year ended March 31st, 2022.
Reports from select committees. Questions to ministers. Request for leave to move the adjournment of the Senate on matters of urgent public importance. Statements by ministers or parliamentary secretaries. Personal explanations. Motions related to the business or sitting of the Senate moved by minister.
Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move the suspension of Standing Order 45-2 and 22-1 for the remainder of today's sitting.
The question is that Standing Orders 22-1 and 45-2 be suspended for the remainder of today's sitting. Will those honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. No. Methinks the ayes have it. Those standing orders are accordingly suspended for the remainder of today's sitting.
Introduction of bills.
Senator Cummins. Mr. President, I beg to give notice and to move the first readings of the Bail Bill 2024 and the Criminal Justice Plea Agreements and Negotiations Bill 2024.
The question is that the Bail Bill 2024 and the Criminal Justice Plea Agreements and Negotiations Bill 2024 be read the first time. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. I think the ayes have it.
That is automatic.
Those bills are accordingly read a first time.
On this bill?
Yes.
Mr. President, I advise that we're taking order number 6 on the supplementary order paper, which stands in the name of the leader, honorary leader of the Senate, and will be introduced by Senator, the Honorable C.J. Blackman. And the item of business is to move the second reading of the Bail Bill 2024.
Senator Blackman.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise with respect to the bill before us this morning. And I want to start by saying, Mr. President, that in order for society to be governed, and in order for that said society to be governed well, particularly with respect to law and order and good governance, governments around the world governments across the Commonwealth, governments across the Caribbean, and certainly this government and this chamber is no different. And therefore, in such a pursuit, we are therefore here this morning to debate the bill before us. And I want to start at the onset in making it lucidly clear that this administration is settled on one thing: that there can be no room for crime, there can be no room for serious crime, and therefore Barbados as a country must also be on board in that pursuit of a zero tolerance to criminal matters in this country. And therefore the issue and the bill before us is not just one that is of significant import to the government. Certainly, Mr. President, I and my colleagues on this side are of the strong persuasion that it is also a matter of significant importance to the opposition, to independent senators, because why? It goes to the heart of stable governance in our society. And therefore I see this debate within that context, given the importance of the bill and given the importance of ensuring that as we move the society forward, that we can govern and govern well, and ensuring, as I said, issues of good governance for the pursuit of ensuring that our society can continue to function and function well in the interests of all. And it is therefore even more important to send a very clear message, not just to those here, but around the world, that Barbados, in its pursuit of zero tolerance of crime and serious criminal matters, that the entire ecosystem of our governance structure is behind the mantra of that zero tolerance in crime in Barbados. And I start on that basis so that I frame today's debate within the context of this not just being a bill brought by the government side, but it is a bill brought by the government side in pursuit of its mandate to the people of Barbados, people born and people unborn, that we must ensure that the law protects the interests of our people, and should you run afoul of the law, not only are there consequences to those actions that can impede the good governance and stability of our country, but that you understand that the weight of the law will also be upon you. I want to recall, Mr. President, that since coming to office in 2018, this administration has taken significant and serious measures relative to crime and criminal matters in Barbados. It is a priority. It was then when we first came into office in 2018, and it remains one now, 6 years after, in pursuit of that governance and stability that I treat to. And I want to also recall, Mr. President, that in 2018, the administration would have convened a national security briefing where different interest groups and stakeholders were convened. And it included, of course, the then opposition leader, senators, senior public servants, former commissioners of police. And you may ask yourself, why would an administration do that so early in its term and at the onset of their term? As I said, this administration understands that if Barbados is to continue to be a stable society, a society which protects its citizens and those who live here and visit us, those who do business here, our mothers, our grandmothers, our children, that stability must be underscored by ensuring that criminal matters receive significant attention, the necessary resources to treat to creating that ecosystem, and also ensuring that those who may want to run afoul of the law understand that the ecosystem will not facilitate such a negative interest. And therefore, when you look at where we were in the court system, Mr. President, you may recall that at the time there were only 2 judges on rotation. Now, when you look at that fact, and it's not something that any country could be proud of at the time or generally, but the fact remains is that if you have only 2 judges on rotation in your courts treating to criminal matters, it therefore means there invariably will be a backlog of cases. And that was the case. There was a high level, a high degree of backlogs with respect to the criminal cases moving through our courts. But equally to the task, and resolved in its mind, the administration made clear that it was going to, at the onset, treat to that shortfall. And therefore, in resolving that matter, it led, of course, even before I get to the resolving, that backlog led to judges having to, in those circumstances, oftentimes grant bail so that persons were not subject to lengthy stays on remand. It's a fact. This is the situation we found in 2018. An unfortunate one, but one which confronted the administration, and of course, being elected to govern, what must you do, Mr. President? You must govern. And the administration took a decision that that was not fit for purpose for a modern criminal justice system in this country. And therefore, the government appointed an additional 3 judges at that time. And last 2 years, in 2022, an additional 3. And therefore, you see now a situation where you don't only have the 2, but you have more judges, and the cases can now move quicker through the system. Why? In the pursuit of justice, and also ensuring that the criminal justice system and that wider ecosystem, as I spoke about, can function and is fit for purpose in a modern Barbados. Now, equally, and to the system's credit, notwithstanding the difficult time that COVID presented, the court system was able to move the cases through. And we now had a situation where in 18 months, Mr. President, 584 indictable matters were settled. 584. We also saw 61 of those cases were for murder. And of course, the government increased the number of prosecutors and the support staff. Because why? If you're going to bring cases to court, you also have to ensure, as I said, in that ecosystem, the tiers and the limbs that help it to function are functioning well and have the capacity to be able to meet that increased demand in its use, so as to ensure that the system is moving well. We'd also recall, Mr. President and my dear colleagues, that last year, the Office of the Attorney General held a 2-day symposium focusing on the criminal justice reform. And why is this important? Because if we are to, as I said at the onset, look beyond the now, being cognizant, of course, of where we've come from, the realities currently on the ground now, but where do we go to ensure that our criminal justice system is fit for purpose? You constantly, like many other things, have to take a pause and to review. And therefore, they held that 2-day symposium with members of the legal fraternity, and members of the judiciary, and of course, members of our police service. But they've gone further. We've gone further as an administration. We've seen in this chamber legislation such as the Criminal Procedure Amendment 2024, judge alone trials, and also legislation with respect to plea bargaining to help ease the backlog. Now, if we look across CARICOM, both our sister nation of Jamaica, and in addition, Belize, have seen the benefit of the plea bargaining system to their jurisdictions. And Barbados is no different. Because as I said, part of the modern governance structure of a society, certainly within the Commonwealth, has to be the constant review and retooling of said justice system and ensuring that one, it's fit for purpose, but two, you have the capacity to treat to the changing tide on the ground with respect to crime and serious criminal matters that come before the courts. And when we look at also the staff complement that was also given to the Director of Public Prosecutions, that was also increased. And why am I going through this and taking us back from where we started as a government? Is to not only frame the debate within the context of a broader retooling of our system, but to help our honorable members in this chamber on all sides and the wider public to have an appreciation as to where we started, where we're going, how we intend to get there, and equally, what mischief are we trying to treat them? Because it's important that the public understands where we're at and where are we going to go, and why these measures, in our view, are necessary for the times to ensure that stability and good governance that we were all sent to do by the public and in their interests. And as I said, Mr. President, this administration is incredibly serious about the issue of fighting crime. I want to repeat, this administration is very serious on the issue of fighting crime and serious criminal matters in Barbados, and therefore, as we debate today, as we go forward, see it in its broadest context. Because why? It is not a knee-jerk reaction to anything. Part of the governance requires us, Mr. President, that as circumstances change, so too must your posture in ensuring that stability remains. It's just like running a company, running a household. If you're out on a course or on a ship or aircraft, but you see that all of a sudden there are turbulent winds, there's significant turbulence in the aircraft. Notwithstanding that the pilot and the co-pilot may have the aircraft on a certain trajectory, it requires them to pause and take stock and assess the situation and to move forward so that you can land the plane safety in the interests of everyone. And this bill, therefore, within the context of where we are as a country, is no different, as I said. We also saw a situation where our police had their budget increase. And why is that also important? Because if the police, who are, and let me take this moment to publicly, once again, praise them for the human service that they're delivering to all of us as a country, they are on the front line of ensuring that we are safe. They are on the front line of ensuring that they have the tools and ability and capacity to respond to moments where there's unrest or there's crime or there's a murder. And therefore, the government saw it necessary to ensure that our police service have the necessary tools and the requisite training to ensure that they also come in to even more modern times of policing. Because the truth is, you may have gone to training school, as all of them do, and you may learn one thing. But as crime and the modalities of crime change, you have to constantly retool. Similarly, lawyers do the same thing in their profession, doctors do the same thing in their profession, accountants do the same thing in their profession, and therefore the government saw the wisdom and the necessity to ensure that the resources and the requisite resources are at the disposal of our police. And I want to again thank our police service for the yeoman service that they deliver. Now, with respect to ensuring that the entire apparatus of the criminal justice system is functioning well and responding to the needs of our country, Not only then is it about equipping our police, not only is it about equipping the Director of Public Prosecution and their office, it is also about ensuring, as I said, should there be a crime, should there be a serious crime, what apparatus does the law have to ensuring that, one, there's a high level of deterrence in the system, but two, we're not having a revolving door where persons can pass through that said justice system and commit crimes whilst they're accused or before the courts, out on bail, and reoffend again. That is at the heart of today's debate. That is at the heart of the very debate. And you'll recall, Mr. President, that in 2019, some 4 years ago, the government sought to make amendments and made the amendments in the Bail Act. And when you look at section, in particular, section 5A of that act, the issue was that it required the court to deny bail to persons charged with murder or for firearm offenses for at least 24 months. Okay? It came through Parliament, it passed, and that was the law. This section, however, was tested in the High Court and was found to be unconstitutional. And therefore, it went to the appeal court, where it's still a pending decision. But given the circumstances, as I said, like any good pilot, like any good head of a household, like any good head of a company, it requires us from time to time, notwithstanding the trajectory of direction of where we want to go and where we need to go, that you have to evaluate and reevaluate given where you are. And where we are today, Mr. President, is no different. And I'm sure our colleagues, as they not only debate, but as they sit quietly in contemplation as to where we are with respect to fighting crime and serious crime in our country, would appreciate that the government, therefore, within the context of that reevaluation, but also ensuring good governance is there, would appreciate that this is necessary within the circumstances. So therefore, of course, the country awaits the decision of the Court of Appeal. But equally, the government, given the circumstances we have before us today, has taken the view that we cannot wait on the decision given the circumstances. So of course, the court will continue its process independent from the government. But the government is here today because why? It requires us to protect our people and to protect the very system of criminal justice itself in the interest of all. And therefore, when you listen to the public outcries, Mr. President, and I'm sure all colleagues on all sides would agree, there is a strong view in Barbados, a country 21 by 14 miles wide, a population of just under 300,000, not large by any stretch of any imagination, by any indicator, where generally we all know each other, plus or minus, that crime, and let's get real and let's get specific now, murder, attempted murder, gun crimes cannot be tolerated in Barbados. It's simply too small for it to happen. And why am I saying this? The government spends significant money on education. And this is not just this administration, I'm talking government in its totality of Barbados, where we try to create an environment where people can have opportunities, where people can go to school and learn. We create a climate where people can come and invest. We create a climate where people can come and host international tournaments. We create a climate here where communities can have their fish fry on a Saturday. But all of that can be eroded by one gunshot. All of that can be eroded by one person not involved in any criminal activity being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And they would have left home in circumstances to go about their ordinary business, and unfortunately may not return home because of a single act of a serious crime. And therefore, as I said, with respect to that good governance, we have to ensure that our people are protected. Equally, there are persons who find themselves in criminal activities now. So you're not talking about you're in the wrong place at the wrong time. You are part and parcel of criminal activity. And because of one issue or the other, one disagreement or the other, there are reprisals. And this body and their emotions were wounded, or you have something that belongs to me, and a whole host of other issues. And you're having murders, you're having attempted murders, you're having people being found with firearms. The last time I checked, Mr. President, and I'm sure my colleagues today can confirm and agree with me, Barbados is the oldest producer of rum. We manufacture rum, we produce rum, we produce world-class cricketers. We have an abundance of culture. We produce crop over. We produce some of the best seasonings in the world, Mr. President. We produce things that tourists come and enjoy. But one thing I don't see on our production and manufacturing sheets, and one thing I don't see on our export sheets, is the production of weapons. And therefore, it begs the question, one, not only where do they come from, but given that we don't produce these things, it therefore means that there's a problem that we all know, but we have to address it. And I also want to frame this in a broader context. There is that temptation, and I heard the Honorable Senator Morris in a recent program refer to the fact, and he's right, that this is not just a phenomenon being experienced by Barbados alone. Sadly, across our region today, country after country after country continues to grapple with the issue of gun crime, because the ease of which countries can have access, illegally of course, to guns coming out of the north into our waters is a major problem. There are a lot of capacity issues, of course, but we have to collectively treat to these things. So I place that point there for context, so that as we realize and as we look ahead in this debate and beyond, it is not just about the bail bill. The bail bill is taking place in a broader context of which we must address regionally, which clearly we are addressing nationally, but we have an obligation to make sure that we protect all within our jurisdiction. And therefore, the public concern is real, it is justified, and it is a view also held by the government. You've heard Prime Minister Motley speak to it time and time again, the Attorney General speak to it time and time again, you've heard the Commissioner of Police speak to it time and time again. No one in Barbados who has the interests of Barbados at heart wants to see crime and serious crime taking place in our country. And therefore, we echo that not only by words, but by virtue of the bill here today. But equally, what is of concern is the simple fact that you have a person or persons, Mr. President, being brought before the courts for a criminal matter, and in this context, murder, or being found with a firearm or firearms in their possession. They go through the court system, but they get bailed. They're out on the streets again. And you would believe that if you are given a chance to maintain your freedom pending trial, that the logical person, in my view, would honestly use that as a time for reflection, for pause, and awaiting trial and the outcome. But we found time and 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 time again, the number of persons who are brought before the courts receiving bail are now recommitting offenses whilst out on bail. When we talk about, as I said, the good governance of society, ensuring that there's stability and peace amongst our society, this is what we're talking about. And the public outcry on this matter is a very real one, and it is one in which we too, as a government, share that view and share that sentiment. And therefore, what is the state of play as we currently stand? At the end of January, in the system, there were 106 murder cases. 8 were manslaughter cases, and 254. Let me repeat it. There were 254 firearm charges pending. That is no small number. In other words, that is 254 separate charges for firearms in a country that does not produce firearms, in a country that can't ill afford crime and murders and people getting shot when they go about their ordinary business. And you can look on TV or you go to the funerals where mothers and fathers and families have to hold their belly because why? A loved one was taken away from them. What good society is going to stand by and watch that taking place in circumstances where a lot of the perpetrators are already out on bail, are coming back into the system, or society rather, and reoffending. Because why? A lot of them have the view, you know what? I get bail, I can do what I gotta do to you, I get bail again, I can do what I gotta do to you, I get bail again, etc. There can be no place for that, Mr. President, not in Barbados. And the government is sending a very clear message to all and sundry. If you want to commit crime in this country, understand that the law will not allow you to do so. There must be consequences to your actions. In physics, there's a maxim. To every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And so too is this matter. But equally, the number of matters waiting for indictments, not 254 as in the circumstances of the firearm charges, Mr. President. There are some 1,600. They're not. And it therefore justifies what the administration would have done to ensure that we have the adequate number of judges to help us walk through the cases throughout our systems. There are a number of criminal counsel in here today who I'm sure, when they rise, will treat a number of these issues. But this is the state of play where we are. But let's bring it closer home, Mr. President. This year alone, 2024, to date, and I pray this number that I will call will not be surpassed, there have been 26 murders, 26 in Barbados. That small country that I described, 300,000 people or plus or minus. 26 murders. And 17 of those 26, Mr. President, were related to firearm activity. 6 were stabbings, and 2 relative to bludgeoning. Why do I make this point? Because we're not just talking about murder, as I said, serious crimes and firearms, but we're talking about murder and firearms. Therefore, you're starting to see, therefore, a correlation with respect to the high number. And if the criminal element of our society believe that they can do as they like, walk through the court system and come out on bail, do as they like and repeat, who then has the responsibility to stop it? It is not just the government of the day. Of course, the government brings the bill, but it is the ecosystem of governance that has to treat to this issue. Because why? Issue of fighting crime is not a Barbados Labour Party issue. It is not a Democratic Labour Party issue. It is not an independent issue. It is an issue for whomever is in the governance ecosystem of this fair land called Barbados. And therefore, we have taken the decision that now is the time to ensure that our Bail Act is fit for purpose in protecting those mothers, in protecting those young people. And the truth is also, you still have to protect the life of those who unfortunately find themselves in devious activity. Because as a state and as a country, we are there and the laws are there to protect all, notwithstanding the company that you may keep. And therefore, this is a message to all of our people, not just young people, because older people commit crime in this country too. There is no room for crime in Barbados. None. And if you want to commit serious crime, think again. Now, I want to get into some of the meat of the matter of the bill, Mr. President. When we look at clause 6.10, where we see that the defendant, for example, is charged with an offense as outlined in Schedule 1. It treats to what the court shall do in those circumstances. Clause 6.10 with respect to Schedule 1. And I want to start there because it sets out, therefore, now where we are now moving to and where we're coming from. And it invariably states that with respect to the defendant, it orders that the court shall, and as everyone who did law, or know about law, or appreciate law, or curious about law, shall imposes what? It's mandatory. There's no discretion. The court shall. Orders that the defendant be detained in custody until the defendant be dealt with in accordance with the law. In other words, once it is outlined in Schedule 1, as I mentioned, you are held in custody until the case is called, or as you call it, the trial is called. And now there are persons who may think, okay, you have to balance the right of the victims, of course. You have to balance the right of the defendant, particularly with respect to his or her liberty. And therefore, you'll also therefore see, added to that, is unless. And why is that unless so important? And for those listening or watching the debate, this is why. In other words, notwithstanding that you will be placed into custody, the court shall place you into custody until your trial is called, unless, so you still have circumstances that you may be out on bail, but the threshold and the test is no higher, is that the defendant, having been given reasonable opportunity to do so, adduces evidence which satisfies the court that exceptional circumstances exist which, in the interest of justice, permits the defendant's release. So let's make it clear. You're going to shoot somebody, police hold you, the prosecution finds enough evidence, you're charged, etc. You will be detained until your case is called, unless the court deems that in the interest of justice, you should not be. So it now places it on a higher plane. Now, Mr. President, notwithstanding, of course, that Each country has its own jurisprudence and way of dealing with different things. This bill also finds its similarity and the core of it also from our fellow Commonwealth sister nation of South Africa. And it's important to note that whilst it is not binding on the courts of Barbados, it presents a very good moral suasion and guidance as to where we should go in this direction. And when you look at Section 61A of the Criminal Procedure Act in South Africa, it outlines for us that what I call in the interest of justice test. In other words, as I said, you commit a crime with respect to murder or firearm charge, you're going to be detained until the trial is called. Unless, in the interest of justice, it is not fit to do so. And as such, the overriding criteria of the interest of justice to do so is very, very, very clear. Now, when you look at our bill, and in particular clauses 2, you realize that the arguments, Mr. President, that hitherto have been used, and again, I'm sure members of the chamber who practice at the criminal bar are familiar with what I'm about to speak about. No longer can counsel plead, Your Honor, my client has no previous convictions. My client is not previously known to the court. My client is no flight risk. My client is a good and outstanding citizen of the community. All the different reasons that were used as to why bail should be granted. The burden is now placed on you will be detained until the trial has been called, unless it is in the interest of justice for you to be released. So there is now a higher threshold. And of course, that discretion, framed with the unless, is within the court. Because remember, the issue at hand before, when the act was passed in 2019, was that the law had compelled the court. Here, there is a discretion, but that discretion is with respect to ensuring in the interest of justice. And why is this important? It is also to send a message to those who want to commit crime, that if you commit crime, if you commit murder, if you have firearms within your possession, or you use your firearm, think twice again, because you're going to go and spend some time waiting on your trial and your liberty, notwithstanding, of course, that we have to balance it. Once you commit your crime, you have to be aware of these provisions as so envisioned. And under 6.2, we also see that the interpretation that the court will use, and also refusing of the bill with respect to one or more grounds, are as follows. And a whole list of them, Mr. President. I'll just go through a few of them. The likelihood that the defendant, if granted bail, will endanger the public's safety. I've given examples of that this morning. You've committed a crime, you've come back out again, you've committed a crime again. The second one, the likelihood that the defendant, if bail is granted, will attempt to evade trial. There are people who believe that I ain't belong in no court system, no dock. And I remember when I was at law school in the UK, we had to do role play. And I once sat in the dock, Mr. President, in role play. And let me say this again for the public, because you know social media is very funny. I sat in the dock in role play. And sitting in the dock in role play is not a comfortable feeling. And I had to remind myself that at the end of this act, that I get enough of catching train and going home. Because for that moment, it felt so real, I could not believe or I could not fathom how it felt to be sitting in a dock accused. It is not a good feeling. And therefore, the point I'm making with that, to stay out of that realm, the best thing to do is to stay away from crime. But I go on. Where the likelihood of that defendant, if granted bail, will attempt to influence or intimidate witnesses or conceal or destroy evidence. Mr. President, we've all heard stories after time, where persons accused, persons who are out on bail, will tell you, if it was you, I would not go to court. If I was you, I would not go and give evidence, because if you do, so-and-so can happen to your family, so-and-so can happen to you. That level of intimidation cannot be, because why the criminal justice system must ensure that there's protection for witnesses, and ensuring also that people must face justice. And I go on. Where the likelihood that a defendant, if granted bail, will undermine or jeopardize the objectives of the proper functioning of the criminal justice system itself. In other words, you don't want a situation where releasing the person will cause the entire system, which we all rely on and look upon, to come into disrepute or even to be questioned. Because the law has to be sacrosanct, and we have to ensure that the law can be protected in the interests of all and in the interests of justice. And of course, where in exceptional circumstances, the likelihood that the release of the defendant will not be in the interests of the order, of public safety, or public security. Now, I want to focus on this last part here, which is invariably 2E on the clause. Now, in considering, and this is where it gets very interesting, and this is where the meat of the matter comes. Considering the grounds as established under that provision, the court may take into account, Mr. President, the following. Whether the nature of the offense or the circumstances where the offense was committed is likely to induce a sense of shock and outrage in the community. What do I mean by that? And what does the clause and the provision mean and contemplate by that? We only have to look, and unfortunately, at different crimes that we've seen within the last 10 years, 15 years as a nation. We may all recall the shock and the horror that we as a country endured with the gruesome death of those young ladies in the Campus Trends incident and crime. Those types of, and of course, all criminal matters, all murders are serious and none more than the other. But as humans also, and as a community, there are certain crimes and certain murders, Mr. President, that have evoked a certain national deep outcry of zero tolerance to these sorts of things. And that is one example. Another example, you may cast your mind back to one good morning, there was, I think, an interview taking place on national television. And whilst that interview was being taking place on national television, literally, a gunman executed, that's what you have to call it, in plain sight, a victim, whilst the interview was taking place on national television. Those moments which caused shock at a time when the mall was at its highest doing business, just outside of the food court, I'm sure many of you remember. These are moments that this aspect, for example, is contemplating. Moments that cause the country to think, hold on, what is happening here? But I go on. Whether the defendant in terms of being released might jeopardize the safety of the defendant. In other words, you've committed a crime, you're released on bail. But in your release on bail, you stand potentially to be harmed or to be murdered. Because why? Reprisals happen. Where a fella believes, okay, you take out my body, I can take out you. And in the interest of that defendant's safety and life, you have to ensure that they don't go back out on the street. So there are a myriad of examples in the contemplation here. But I go on again, because each of these present clear but well important areas for contemplation in the bill. And whether the sense of peace and security among members of the public will be undermined. In other words, people need to go about their ordinary business knowing that there's a sense of calm. I don't have to look over my shoulder. I can do my things without wondering, am I going to be a target today? Whether intentionally or unintentionally. It comes back to that good governance that we speak about. And of course, whether the release will undermine or jeopardize the public confidence in the criminal justice system, as I mentioned. And lastly, any other factor which, in the opinion of the court, should be taken into account. Mr. President, when we look at where we are today, Barbados is a country based on good governance. It is a country based on the rule of law. It is a country based on ensuring that rights of all, subject to any provisions that would impede that, are granted. And therefore, this is one part of our history in that regard. And when you also then look at the bail proceedings, and when you focus on Clause 6, and in particular Clause 613. Now, under the bill, you have a situation where the defendant or the defense's counsel shall inform the court of any previously had offenses that they've had, or any pending charges, or the release on bail prior to these charges. In other words, you have to now declare to the court, you, meaning one, or your counsel, you let the court know if you have any previous convictions, if there are any pending charges, or if you are out on bail already. And therefore, it now places that burden on the defendant to ensure that you disclose this. But it also goes further, that should you at a later time be found to have lied on this, there's a consequence as well. And I think it's 2 years in imprisonment or $5,000 with respect to that. And the point I'm making here is the law is now contemplating tightening up as well, that the system, as I said, in the interest of ensuring that the ecosystem of the criminal justice system is tightened for all. And when you look at the reasons for bail, and I think this is quite new, and my colleagues in the chamber who are at the criminal bar can treat to this, the bill is now saying also, not only must the judge, if they grant you bail, they impose bail, or they deny you bail, reasoning must now be given as to the decision. Reasoning must now be given as to the decision. Why? And therefore, it also ensures that in the fairness of the defendant, that the defendant and his legal team also has in writing clear, well-articulated reasons for the granting, or the denying, or the amending, as it were, or imposition of that bail. As I said, why is it important? Because it lends to the creation of ensuring that the defendant, in particular, has a clear outline as to the reason why the bill was granted or denied. Now, Mr. President, I've outlined where we've come from. I've outlined the circumstances in which we are today. I've outlined the commitment that this administration has had from the onset of taking office in 2018. I've outlined the circumstances which have changed in terms of crime happening on the ground. I've outlined the government's response with respect to resources allocation to our police, to the DPP. I've outlined the government's response with respect to legislation in our parliament. And equally, I've outlined also government's previous passing of the amendment relative to the Bail Act. And the truth of the matter is that in that pursuit, in that ultimate pursuit of ensuring that there's stability and good governance in our country, in that ultimate pursuit of ensuring that there's a zero tolerance to not just crime, but serious crime and murder and firearm offenses, the government has brought this bill here today, so as to ensure that we can continue with our life in an orderly fashion, and also to send a very strong message to those who believe that they can commit crime and go through the revolving door of the current bail system, as if you're walking into a hotel lobby and being met with the bellhop and he walking you back out. No, in Beijing parlance, Mr. President, them days done. And therefore, this bill and its contemplation is to bring some tidiness and a tighter mode with respect to bail and how bail is granted. And with those words, Mr. President, I want to encourage our colleagues not just to debate today or the bill as we usually do, but debate it within the consideration and contemplation that this is a national priority for us, for all of us, irrespective of government, opposition, or independent. Because why? We have to ensure the long-term stability of our nation. We have to ensure the long-term stability of our criminal justice system. We have to ensure the long-term good governance of our country that has made Barbados known around the world for being stable, for being peaceful, and for being prosperous. And with those words, Mr. President, I'm obliged to you, and I beg that this bill be now read a second time.
Senator Walters.
Good morning, Mr. President. Good morning to fellow senators. This debate this morning around the bail bill is a very, I would use a very sensitive conversation, because crime is something that affects both sides of the spectrum, victims and the society as a whole. And so